Hey there, guys, gals, and non-binary pals. We are back with another week of history. Now, this week we are going to be continuing the Cold War, but we are going to be talking about the proxy wars. So we're going to talk about Korea and the Vietnam War, and then we will also be talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I understand is not a war, but it is the closest that the world has ever gotten to nuclear warfare. And so, yeah, it's important to learn about it. Anyways, we are going to jump right in. All right, so the Korean War. Now, it's often called the Forgotten War in the United States because, well, it's forgotten about all the time. The coverage of the 1950s conflict was very highly censored, and its memory, even decades later, still gets overshadowed by World War II and the Vietnam War. It's kind of like that war that is sandwiched in between the two big wars for the United States. But the 3-year conflict in Korea, which pitted the communist and the capitalist forces against each other, it set the stage for decades of tension among North Korea, South Korea, and the United States. It also helped set the tone for the Soviet-American rivalry during the Cold War. And it profoundly shaped the world that we live in today. And I know that that's kind of hard to grasp because we never really learn about it in school. It's just like, oh yeah, there was that war in the 50s and there was the TV show MASH. Sorry, I have like an eyelash in my eye today. So if I'm scratching my eye, it's not a nervous tick. It's like I got something in my eyeball. Okay, so this military conflict. It really can't be properly understood until we consider its historical context. Okay, so that's what we're going to do on this slide is I'm going to give you some historical context so that you truly understand how we got into this conflict to begin with, and so that you understand that it wasn't just a conflict between the United States and Korea, it was also the Korean Civil War. Now, Korea was a Japanese colony from 1910 to 1945. And then it was occupied by the United States and the Soviet Union at the end of World War II, right? So I wouldn't necessarily say we liberate Korea from Japan, but that's kind of how it happens, right? Japan withdraws and we do fight on the Korean Peninsula. And at the end of the day, we all know that, Japan loses its empire at the end of World War II. So the United States and the Soviet Union both were unwilling to leave. They were kind of a little afraid of each other, like, oh, well, if we withdraw, the Soviet Union isn't going to withdraw and they'll just take over all of Korea. And then vice versa. The Soviet Union was like, well, if the United States doesn't withdraw, then, we've lost Korea to democracy. So there was a proposition that was, let's temporarily divide the country along the 38th parallel. So that way, both powers could maintain their influence on the peninsula because the peninsula borders Russia. So it was kind of one of those things that the Soviet Union didn't really want the United States that close to them if they could help it. But the divide, it lasted in part because of the competing visions, not between the USSR and the Americans, but also between Koreans and the future of their country. And this war wasn't, it's so important to me that you understand that this war was not between the United States and the USSR, okay? It was, at its very core, it was the Korean Civil War, and it was fought over issues that go way back into Korea's colonial experience. We're not going to go that far back, but you need to understand that it's so much bigger than just the United States and the USSR. And a lot of times in United States history, that's what we learn, right? We learn, okay, how the Korean War directly influences the United States. And yes, that's still what we're going to learn about today, but it's important to me that you understand this was also the Korean Civil War. In 1948, the American-backed anti-communist Southern administration, which was based in Seoul, they declared themselves the Republic of Korea. It was led by someone named Syngman Rhee. I do apologize. I don't speak Korean, nor do I speak Vietnamese. So if you do, and you are like, woman, you are saying it totally wrong, I'm sorry. I do have phonetically how it's supposed to be said here, but English, right? Okay, so Syngman Rhee, he actually lived in exile in the United States for a lot of years. He was then installed as the South Korean leader by the Office of Strategic Services, which, in case you have no idea what that means, that is actually the predecessor to the CIA, right? The Central Intelligence Agency. And soon after that, the Soviet Union then backed the Communist Northern Administration, which was based in Pyongyang, and it declared itself the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Its leader was Kim Il-sung, who fought alongside communist forces during the Chinese Civil War, which China does prevail as a communist country, which it still is today. And he is the grandfather of North Korea's current leader, or dictator, however you want to perceive him, Kim Jong-un. And each regime, both in the North and in the South, was unstable. Okay, so it's not like, oh, democracy was in the South and it was just fantastic. It wasn't. It was an unstable government. Not only that, but both governments in North and South, they rejected the legitimacy of each other. And they each considered themselves to be Korea's sole rightful ruler. Okay, so this is a civil war. And there were a lot of border skirmishes between the two countries at that 38th parallel. And it was more than just, the United States and the Soviet Union troops meeting or anything like that. Okay, like there was actual skirmishes on the side of South Korea and North Korea between Koreans. Where am I at in my notes? Okay, so the war, it pitted South Korea and the United States against North Korea and China. And I know that that probably strikes some people as rather odd, considering I've been talking about the USSR this whole time, but the USSR was a little afraid of provoking the United States, so they didn't really want to get into a direct conflict. And in the Cold War, the USSR and the United States never meet, like boots on the ground never meet in person in battle. So this one was really China sent troops. The Soviet Union sent supplies and stuff like that. Other nations, they did contribute troops. It wasn't just the United States and South Korea or just China and North Korea. The American forces, though, they did do a lot of the fighting. But that's because the South Korean army virtually collapsed at the start of the war. And this is in large part due to our training of the South Korean army. The Soviet Union, they supported North Korea at the very beginning of the war by giving it arms and tanks and strategic advice. But China soon emerged as the most important ally for North Korea because it would send troops, and that's partially because they wanted to avoid a conflict between China and like China's border with Korea. Yes, I think that's what I mean to say. Okay, and on the next slide, you're not going to have my face, my pretty face, because there's not room, so you will just have my voiceover. Okay, so the war and its legacy, really. The war absolutely devastated Korea. There's a lot of historians that say somewhere between 3 million and 4 million people were killed, although firm figures are going to never be produced, particularly because both governments don't want to admit how many people they lost. But the North Korean government is certainly not going to let that information be known because their regime is still in place. But we do know that as many as probably 70% of the numbers that we do have of dead were civilians. So the biggest casualty here, very much like World War II, was actually civilian casualties. The destruction was particularly acute in the North, which was subjected to years, I mean literal years of American bombing, and this bombing included things like napalm. If you don't know what napalm is, check out Greek fire. That's essentially what it is. It's like a fire bomb. Okay, you drop it and a fire spreads, and you can't just like put it out with water. Water makes it worse, and it's a really bad time. Now, roughly 25% of North Korea's pre-war population was killed, and many of the survivors ended up going underground, and they were living underground by the war's end. Now, North Korea was basically flattened, and they see the American bombings and the destruction of its people as being a type of Holocaust. And every child in North Korea is taught about it, and they are taught about the injustice of the United States interfering in their civil war and how they killed, innocents. And that is largely true. Most of the problem with the United States and Korea is that we didn't really know what the military target was, so we just decided to bomb everything. Now, the damage was also widespread in South Korea, where Seoul, the capital of South Korea, changed hands roughly 4 times during the war alone. And most of the combat actually did take place in the northern and the central parts of the peninsula, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there weren't casualties in the south and that there weren't battles that were fought in the south, because there were, but just the bulk of the fighting did take place in North Korea and in the central parts of the peninsula. Now, the fighting did stop when North Korea, China, and the United States reached an armistice in 1953. Okay, so North Korea, China, and the United States, 1953, they signed an armistice, which is essentially like a ceasefire. And South Korea did not agree to this armistice, and no formal peace treaty has ever been signed. So technically, the Korean War is still ongoing because it's really just a ceasefire. Now, neither North or South Korea really achieved its goal, which means it's not really a victory on either side. The destruction of the opposing regime and the reunification of the divided peninsula was the ultimate goal for both North and South, which obviously they didn't accomplish. Now, since 1953, there's been kind of an uneasy coexistence between the North and the South, and it does currently today host roughly 20,000 American troops. And at one time, there were hundreds of American nuclear weapons actually based in South Korea. Now, the reason why I really want to drive home what Korea means for the United States, right? So we've talked a little bit about the Civil War, the devastation that it caused, but it's going to be from the Korean War onward that the United States has a permanent global American military presence, and we hadn't had that before this war. World War II is really the first war that the United States decided to stretch its legs, for lack of a better term. And when the Korean War rolls around, this is the first time that we really realize, I guess, that we have to have a presence in places that we had previously took part in conflict there. And this is one of those times. So the United States, the Korean War, what it essentially does is the U.S. puts troops permanently there. And that was really our first global military presence. And now, there's American troops everywhere on bases all around the world, Qatar, Japan, Italy, Germany. And the Korean War was really that turning point for America's global role. And in the decades after the war, South Korea, they really transformed themselves. Going back to the fact that this is a civil war, what did the main players, not the United States and China, but the Koreans, what role do they play now? South Korea in particular is an economic powerhouse. You guys ever looked at the bottom of literally almost anything and it says made in Korea? That was made in South Korea. Meanwhile, North Korea became the world's most amazing garrison state, and it actually has the 4th largest army in the world, which is kind of mind-boggling when you think about how small North Korea really is. For North Korea and even for South Korea, they're still fighting the war because for them it's never ended because they haven't achieved their goals of reunification. Okay, so next up we are going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, in October of 1962, the world really seemed to be on the brink of nuclear war. And this was as the leaders of the United States and the USSR decided to engage in a very tense 13-day political and military standoff over the installation of nuclear-armed Soviet missiles on the island of Cuba. Now, the reason why this is important is because Cuba is a mere 90 miles from the United States' shoreline. Now, to put it into perspective for you, that is the distance between Fort Worth and Waco. Okay, so the drive that it takes you from Fort Worth to Waco, that is literally how close Cuba is to the coastline of Florida. Now, this by far is the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. But let's backtrack for a moment, because we can't talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis without talking about Cuba itself and how we even got to be there. Now, in 1959, Cuba had a revolution and they established themselves as a communist country. Now, this really came as a shock to the United States. But a lot of Cubans, they really welcomed Fidel Castro's 1959 overthrow of their government. And the reason why is because their president at the time was really a dictator. It doesn't matter that he had the name president, because he really was a dictator. And his name was Fulgencio Batista. And the United States supported his regime. And this is important, okay? Because the U.S. was supporting a very clearly corrupt and repressive dictator. Now, why would we do that? Because, well, he was pro-American, and he was an ally to U.S. companies, and he was pro-democracy, and we liked that he was not pro-communism. So we were like, sure, we'll just totally turn a blind eye to all the terrible shit that you're doing. Now, at the time, American corporations and wealthy individuals owned nearly half of Cuba's sugar plantations and the majority of its cattle ranches, its mines, and its utilities. So think about that, right? So almost half of the entire country's goods were being not just made, but like they were owned. The raw materials for it were owned by Americans, not by Cubans. And Batista did very little to restrict U.S. operations. So native Cubans felt like, they were getting the short end of the stick. And to be honest, they really were. So even though he was reliably anti-communist, Castro really appealed to the people. And I'm not saying all people, but there were a lot of Cubans who did welcome Fidel Castro's overthrow. Now, Castro, he disapproved of, Batista's American interests and business interests in Cuba. He felt that, Cubans should assume control of their nation, right? And they should have the most production, and they should have the rights to, the land and things like that, the raw materials that Cuba had to offer, and that it shouldn't be in the hands of what are essentially foreigners. Now, almost as soon as Castro comes to power, he immediately took steps to reduce American influence on the island. So he was serious about this. And he nationalized previously American-dominated industries like sugar and mining. He also introduced land reform, so that way, Americans couldn't necessarily buy land in Cuba anymore. And then he actually took like the resorts and stuff that were previously owned by Americans, and he was switching their hands to, government functioning resorts and whatnot. And then he went one step further and he called for the rest of Latin America to do the same thing, to act with that autonomy, to basically push out the United States, because we were supporting corrupt regimes and, we were really inserting ourselves in Latin America. And so he was like, listen, we've had enough of this, and we are going to, take control of our own stuff. Now, in May of 1960, Castro established a diplomatic relationship with the Soviet Union, and this really started to worry the United States, because remember, it's only 90 miles away. That is a foreign country who just fell to communism that is right near the United States. And the way the U.S. responded to this was prohibiting the importation of Cuban sugar to the United States. Why is that important? Well, because in order to keep Cuba's economy from collapsing, because of the sugar imports that the United States made up roughly 80% of, the USSR had to agree to buy that, right? They had to figure out how to keep the Cuban economy from collapsing because we were one of their biggest importers. It was an export from Cuba, import to the US. Whew, gosh, my brain, I swear it's going to work today. In January of 1961, right, the US government, it severed all diplomatic relations with Cuba, and we started to step up preparations for a possible land invasion of the island. And in 61, we also gained a new president, and that's John F. Kennedy. And Castro's regime, it was considered to be a huge threat to US national interests. And so much so that America sent secret operatives that tried to assassinate him. This is where you get all of the stories about how the CIA does, America's dirty work and all that stuff, because it was proposed and executed in large part by the CIA. But we did send them secretly, and you guys, this was America trying to overthrow a foreign country. Like, yes, we're capable of doing that. I know some people might find that hard to believe. Now, the CIA did think that President Kennedy would eventually allow them, or really allow the American military to intervene on Cuba. And so they thought that, if they could get Castro assassinated, that President Kennedy would okay an invasion. However, Kennedy's administration, like President Eisenhower, they were not going to militarily involve the United States in any unnecessary wars. And that's because both President Eisenhower and President Kennedy fought in World War II, so they understood the cost of such a large-scale war. And so while they did try to overthrow Castro via espionage and sabotage, they never went as far as to provoke an all-out war with Cuba. All right, moving right along, we're going to talk about Vietnam. That was a rhyme that I didn't mean to make, but we'll roll with it, yeah? So the Vietnam War is going to be very similar to the Korean War. Both of those wars have roots in the Truman Doctrine and the domino theory, which, in case I didn't explain the domino theory, which I don't think I did, the domino theory is the idea that if you have one country that falls to communism, the country neighboring it that borders it will also fall to communism until the whole world is communist. So similar to Korea, the countries were split into communist North and democratic South. Now, after Korea, obviously the Cold War intensified because now we had a presence abroad, and then we see the Cuban Missile Crisis, so things were definitely escalating. And there was already issues in Vietnam before the United States decided to insert itself and intervene. France had been fighting, that's not a word. France had been fighting the Vietnamese people for several years with our indirect support. So we would send, munitions or war supplies or things like that, but not actual boots on the ground. And yeah, we helped fund the military efforts that were made by the French army to defeat, the possibility of there being communism in Vietnam. But not only that, it has deeper roots. Vietnam was also a colonial holding for the French, and then before that, there was some other white people there. And yeah, so anyways, U.S. intervention in Vietnam didn't actually start until 1955, and this was shortly after the French exit. And I know that you guys are thinking 1955, I thought Vietnam War was in the 60s. It does start in the 60s, but we are indirectly aiding both South Vietnam and then before that the French. So President Eisenhower, who was the president in the 50s, he pledged his support to South Vietnam when the French did exit. So that way, don't worry, we will aid South Vietnam in their goals to be a democracy. And like I said earlier, both Kennedy and Eisenhower, they saw the destruction that was World War II, and so they didn't really want to involve the United States in a land war, especially in Asia. So, because we had just finished up the Korean conflict, so we were financially aiding. We were not boots on the ground aiding. But in 1959, North Vietnam invaded Laos, and by 1961, they had used roughly 30,000 men to build invasion routes, not just into Laos, but also through Cambodia, so that way they could invade South Vietnam. Now, when President Kennedy enters office in 61, his inaugural address made a very ambitious pledge. He said, quote, "The United States must pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, in order to assure the survival and the success of liberty." End quote. In 1961, the United States had nearly 50,000 troops based in Korea, and Kennedy was facing a three-part crisis. He had the Bay of Pigs invasion, which involves Cuba. He had the construction of the Berlin Wall in Germany, and he also was trying to negotiate a settlement between the pro-Western government of Laos and the communist movement that was on the rise there. So these crises, they made Kennedy believe that, if we failed, the United States failed again to gain control and to stop communism or the expansion of communism, that it would really damage the United States' credibility as a power in the world. So Kennedy was, determined to really draw a line in the sand, but he wasn't willing to go so far as to have a large-scale military intervention in Vietnam. Upon becoming president, after Kennedy was assassinated, Lyndon B. Johnson took office. That was Kennedy's vice president, and he immediately began to really zero in on what was going on in Vietnam. And this was on November 24th of 1963. President Johnson said this, quote, "The battle against communism must be joined with strength and determination," end quote. A U.S. large-scale military intervention in Vietnam finally does present itself to the United States with something that we call the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and this is in 1964. The U.S. destroyer, the Maddox, it exchanged some shots with a North Vietnamese torpedo boat, supposedly. Come to find out, this was actually a farce. This was something that we were looking for a reason to intervene in Vietnam, but we didn't want to look as like we were the aggressor. So we made up an intervention between the Maddox and a North Vietnamese torpedo boat. And it was used as a pivotal moment for the United States. It was this moment that we decided to launch a large scale military invasion because we wanted a reason to go into Vietnam. And oh look, this North Vietnamese torpedo boat shot at a U.S. destroyer. That is a declaration of war. So in March of 1965, Johnson makes a decision, and might I add that he had firm support from the American public when he made this decision to send U.S. combat forces into a battle in Vietnam. By June, we had 82,000 combat troops stationed in Vietnam. And he really escalates this quite quickly. There were a lot of concerns from his advisors about this escalation, but he wanted to really, gung-ho, march forward, let's get as many people as we can in there. But there was a growing anti-war movement in the United States. And especially once Johnson authorized the immediate dispatch of an additional 100,000 troops by the end of 1965, and then he requested another 100,000 troops in early 1966. So you're talking within 1 year, we have almost 300,000 troops that are about to go to Vietnam. And that was concerning. This was escalation in a way that the United States had not seen since World War II. All right, so in general, the United States' military forces in the region, they pursued something called a policy of attrition. Now, we talked a little bit about attrition way back, in World War I, pre-COVID-19 virus. I keep forgetting to call it COVID-19, whatever. Anyhow, a policy of attrition is not aiming at taking enemy territory. It is aiming at taking enemy troops, the lives of enemy troops. So instead of securing territory, your entire goal is to kill the enemy so much so that they cannot continue the war. That is a war of attrition. And this was really ridiculous on the United States part, but I guess I can kind of see it because, Vietnam was a smaller country than us, and we thought we could just, throw troops at Vietnam and, that would be fine. By 1966, there were large areas of South Vietnam that had been designated as free fire zones. And supposedly what these free fire zones were that they were evacuated entirely of civilians. So anybody caught in those free fire zones were enemy combatants. Now the problem with this is that there's a lot of controversy over how much warning, I guess, we gave. Like, yes, they dropped pamphlets, but were those pamphlets in Vietnamese or were they in English? And there's just a whole lot of controversy on how much of a solid effort the United States made to actually evacuate civilians so that way only enemy combatants remained. But anyways, we heavily bombed and shelled these zones, and we made them virtually uninhabitable. So refugees are going to start pouring into camps that were designated safe areas near Saigon and other major cities. By November of 1967, the number of American troops in Vietnam was approaching 500,000, and U.S. casualties was approaching about 15,000 and 100,000 wounded. Now, as the war started to stretch on, some soldiers, finally realized, they really started to mistrust their government for keeping them there. Like, why are we here? We're not winning. And this is the danger of having a war of attrition, because even like with World War I, right? The troops were really fixated on what are we doing here? What is our purpose? And when you're not taking territory, there's not like a clear goal, right? So it's hard to put into perspective for the troops. You're here fighting this, right? Take that hill. You see that hill? Take that hill. But when you're fighting a war of attrition, it's no longer, hey, take that hill. It's, well, just kill as many people as you possibly can. My ferrets just decided to wake up. You can come here. Say hello. Say hello. My name is Midas. You guys want out? Okay, hold on a second. I have to let them out. Sorry. Out of my office. Before I do, this one is Flitwick. Say hello. Oh, bless you. Okay. All right, get out of here. All right, I'm so sorry. Or am I? I just secretly wanted to show off my ferrets. Where was I? Oh, right, soldiers coming to mistrust their government. And that's because they just really didn't have a goal. And the later years of the war really started to see an increase in both physical and psychological deterioration among U.S. soldiers. Obviously, I have the numbers for U.S. soldiers because, duh, well, this is U.S. history. But there were, mutinies, there were attacks by soldiers against their officers. There was large drug use because they were essentially self-medicating post-traumatic stress disorder. So yeah, I mean, it was a bad time for North Vietnam. Well, I mean, the war in general for both sides. Okay, so like 2 slides ago, I kind of talked a little bit about how there were anti-war protests and how those were really on the rise. Now, as the conflict wore on, we start to really see the buildup of America's real first big anti-war movement. And specifically especially in 1968 and 1969, there were literally hundreds of anti-war marches all across the United States, gatherings across the country, protesting the war in Vietnam. And a big part of the reason why is because the American people also weren't entirely sure what we were doing in Vietnam, I mean, other than we're supposed to be there to combat communism. So on November 15th of 1969, the largest anti-war protest in American history took place in Washington, D.C. It was like 250,000 Americans actually gathered peacefully, calling for the withdrawal of American troops in Vietnam. Now, keep in mind that this is the largest anti-war march, okay, not the largest march in general. I think the largest march now in DC was actually the women's marches in 2016. I think we ended up beating the civil rights movement. Like Martin Luther King's famous speech that he gave, that was the largest march in general for the United States. And I think we broke that record in 2016 with the women's marches. So I'm not, don't hold me to that, but just fun side note, this is just the largest anti-war protest. Stop getting my toes. It's not fun. Stop it. Sorry, my ferret is trying to get my feet. Tickles. Okay, so the anti-war movement, right? It was particularly strong across college campuses because, duh, it's higher education, right? Like, you're here to expand your mind and to challenge things that you thought you previously knew. So it's very strong on college campuses. But most importantly, what the anti-war movement did is it divided Americans fiercely and bitterly. You know, for a lot of young people, the war symbolized a form of unchecked authority, right? And they come to resent it. They're watching their brothers and their friends go off to fight in what they considered to be a war that really didn't involve us. And to be honest, it didn't. It was a civil war that we involved ourselves in. For other Americans, particularly older Americans, the idea of opposing the government was just downright unpatriotic and treasonous, which I always think is kind of funny because, to be honest, you guys, I mean, we're a country built on protest. The most American thing you can do is protest. What do you think the Boston Tea Party was? It was a protest. Right? I mean, that's the thing is America was really built on protesting. So to think that it's unpatriotic or treasonous to protest just kind of makes me giggle a little bit. Anyways, protests on college campuses continued across America. But there are two protests in particular that just became violent. And one of those protests was at Kent State in Ohio, and the other one was in Jackson State at Jackson State in Mississippi. Now, National Guardsmen and police, they were on, site, and they, felt overwhelmed by the crowd surging, and they actually fired into the crowd, and they killed 6 student protesters who were unarmed. And this was a huge deal. It was a really, really big deal. As the first real casualties here on the United States' soil, right? So Vietnam is that war that's taking place an ocean away. It didn't touch us. Yes, we saw video footage of what was going on over there, but it was still an ocean away, right? But now you have American students on American campuses bleeding American blood on American soil. It's just it's a change. A lot of Americans who were previously like, the government, is right and you shouldn't question it, even they were starting to doubt, and they were like, man, I think we should start, withdrawing out of Vietnam. And that's exactly what happens. It's shortly after these two events that the first U.S. troops are going to be withdrawn from the Vietnam War. The people who did remain as these first several, thousand troops were withdrawn, those who remained behind grew increasingly angry and increasingly frustrated. We had a big problem with morale and a larger problem with leadership during the Vietnam War. But there are going to be tens of thousands of soldiers who are going to receive dishonorable discharges. They're also, not just for their behavior during the war, but also for desertion. Nearly 500,000 American men between 65 and 73 became a draft dodger, meant that they fled to Canada to invade conscription. My grandfather was one of those. And, but yeah, Nixon actually called an end to the draft in 1972, and he instituted an all-volunteer army the next day. Give me just a second. One of my ferrets wants in or out. I don't know. What are you doing? You're making all the Go on. Go. What is it? Okay, I apologize. He's just being needy. Where were we? Where were we, Midas? Oh, calling it into the draft. So the draft, it does exist technically, but it won't be established. And the draft dodgers from Vietnam actually ended up being forgiven, so they could come back to the U.S. of A. All right, so let's talk about the legacy of the Vietnam War. Now, this long conflict, it affected an immense majority of the country's population. In 8 years of warfare, an estimated 2 million Vietnamese died, and 3 million were wounded, and another 12 million Vietnamese became refugees, meaning that they, were essentially forced to flee their own country. And the war, it devastated Vietnam, and it devastated the country's infrastructure, its economy, and reconstruction was very, very slow. In 1975, communist forces do successfully seize control of Saigon, and they did effectively end the Vietnam War. And the country, Vietnam, was unified as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam the following year. Now, troops, like I said, American troops had been withdrawing from Vietnam. And yeah, the communists do successfully overthrow the democratic country in South Vietnam. Now, there is going to be sporadic violence that does continue over the next 15 years. It does include conflicts with neighboring China and Cambodia. So it's not like once our part of the Vietnam War ended, there was more war to fight for the Vietnamese. Now, under a broad free market policy that had been put in place in 1986, the economy in Vietnam does start to improve. It was boosted by oil export revenues and an influx of foreign capital. But trade and diplomatic relations between Vietnam and the United States were really unsteady and unstable all the way until the 1990s. And that's because our nation, spent more than $120 billion on the conflict in Vietnam from 1965 to 1973. And this massive spending really led to widespread inflation here in the United States that was worsened by a worldwide oil crisis that occurred in 1973, and fuel prices end up skyrocketing. Now, psychologically, this war's effects really ran deep, and they still do today. First and foremost, this war pierced the myth of American invincibility, and it bitterly divided our nation for the first time in many, many years. Now, many returning veterans, they're going to face negative reaction from both opponents of the war. People who felt like they were, who were anti-war protesters, who felt we shouldn't have been in Vietnam at all, they viewed them as having killed innocent civilians, being baby killers and things of those lines. Now, the supporters of the war also hated them, and that's because they saw these veterans as being the people who lost them the war. There's going to be a lot of both psychological and physical damage that a lot of veterans from this war are going to suffer, and I don't just mean psychologically like post-traumatic stress disorder, but there were effects from very harmful chemical herbicides, one of which was called Agent Orange. There's a lot of different Agent whatevers. There's like an Agent Blue, there was an Agent Green. Agent Orange seems to be the most prominent of the chemicals that we used. In case you don't know what the landscape of Vietnam was, we fought in the jungles, predominantly in Vietnam. And in order to fight in the jungle, we thought that the best way to drive out our enemy was to kill all of the vegetation there. And so we had these like really dangerous chemicals that we were spraying, and guess who was spraying those? That's right, it was Vietnam soldiers. Now later it's going to be revealed that Agent Orange and the other agent herbicides are going to cause serious health issues, and anything from tumors to birth defects to rashes, and also psychological problems and cancer.
But it wasn't just among the US servicemen, but also their families. And that's what I mean by the effects of this, not just physically, but psychologically, run very deep in the United States' psyche. In 1982, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is going to be unveiled in Washington, D.C., and on it were inscribed the names of 57,939 American Armed Forces personnel that were either killed or missing during the war. Now, there are going to be later additions once, time goes on and we find, more survivors from POW camps, and we discover bones and such, and it has brought the official total so far on the Vietnam Veterans War Memorial to a grand total of 58,200 men and women, people in general.
All right, scholars, that's all I have for you this week. Now that we are finished with the 1950s, we will be moving on to the 1960s and the 1970s. Make sure to take your content test for this week, and I will see you all next week. Have a good one.